So, stream should be live, close enough to on time for all practical purposes. Let me bring up the slides, which I'm not calling a PowerPoint because they're not PowerPoint. They are something else. Apple Keynote to be precise. Let me get chat up too. And there we go. So not calling a PowerPoint because sound looks good. Sounds good. So mapping the past of the Capital District of New York. I gave this talk to my Rotary Club a couple weeks back, and unfortunately we didn't get a recording of it, and I also had to kind of cut it a little bit short. And so I decided to do it again online and maybe also get some questions online. If you're watching this on Twitch, then you can go to the talk with chat live and type your questions in. And start out with this map I'm looking at right here. This map, 1843. This is the shoreline of Albany on the left and Rensselaer on the right. It is Albany in 1843. It's not actually Rensselaer yet. It is three separate cities, Greenbush, Bath, and I forget what the third one was. These would merge to form modern Rensselaer later. The other thing that you'll see here, you see that there is this dock and this thing called the Albany Basin. We're going to talk a little bit about that because that's something for which there is little trace today, but it was important to Albany at times in the past. We zoomed in on this map a little bit, and the other thing we can see up here is that on the top, just slightly right of center, are a version of the terminus of the Erie Canal as it appeared in 1843. Let's take a quick look over here at Rensselaer, and we see an island. That island is just part of the mainland today because this channel around the east side of the island is completely filled in. So among other things, that means that Broadway in Rensselaer today, which is mostly a little bit of ways away from the river, was right along this channel way back then. So that's just kind of an indication of how much things have changed in the period. I think that's a thing that you come to appreciate as a historical mapper. Now the other thing that I'm going to bring your attention to here, and it's something that I do not know yet, that I am planning to learn. In the late 1700s, the state engineer and surveyor Simon DeWitt did two maps of Albany. One of the maps he showed the old Dutch and British neighborhoods along the river, which basically stopped not exactly at the top of State Street, but they basically stopped right in front of the Capitol where State meets Washington and where the City Hall is located. And then DeWitt's second map showed a projection of the city westward and included the area which we call the Pastors neighborhood. And that was mostly a rectilinear grid, which is not dissimilar to what was imposed on Manhattan by their street planning commission. And the result is that you get maps both of Manhattan and of Albany which show the rectilinear grid that's planned even though it's not built yet, which is sort of an interesting situation. You see up here there's also an inset showing an older map of Albany, and we'll look at some older maps of Albany going forward in the presentation. So first of all, work is all being done in context of OpenHistoricalMap. OpenHistoricalMap is derived from OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap is a free map of the world as it is, that is to say, what it is right now. Open Historical shares many tools and concepts, but OpenHistoricalMap is about the past. Basically, it's a place to map things that once were but don't belong in OpenStreetMap because they don't exist anymore. And the goal of OHM is to be the most comprehensive, obsolete map of the world. So what is it? It's mostly a blank canvas, and people do projects in it that are of interest to them, so they are often mapping city centers in the past, highway networks. There's some work being done on the Lincoln Highway, which was the first major transcontinental highway, predating the national highway system. A lot of work being done on railways. Canals are important in a period. I personally map defunct racetracks. That was how I started an open historical map years ago. It was a place to go put down what I know about where racetracks used to be. So I'm going to offer an example from the Ghost Tracks project. This is the modern OpenStreetMap view of Maiden. So we have Broadway here, diagonally across the left. We have the Troy Manans Bridge and New York 378 crossing, and we have Interstate 787 here. The blue oval right here was where Empire Raceway or Manan Speedway, depending on the era, it had different names, had been located. And it's sitting right on the footprint of what we would tend to call today the old Two Guys building, although it has not actually been the Two Guys department store in decades. But when it was last a publicly accessible building, it was the Two Guys department store. And so we're going to take a look at where this information came from. This is a 1952 aerial image of the same area. What's the first thing that we see here is there's no Interstate 787 because it wasn't there in 1952. We see that there was a water feature here, a channel which created an island. That all went away. When 787 was built, we see that 378 just dumps directly onto Broadway. Go back to the previous page. You'll see that 378's rerouting included going up the hill in a relatively high-speed section. But that wasn't built yet in 1952, and we also see the footprint of the drive-in movie theater that once existed in what is now basically the former Two Guys parking lot. So, yeah, Manans looks kind of different. And these are the kinds of things that you start to discover, is just how much the map, the footprint of things has changed just in the period since 1952. I personally find it a little stunning because having been born in 1958, I'm not used to thinking of 1952 as being that long ago. And then when I do think about it, I realize, well, how bloody old I am, but, you know, I've seen a lot more than I realize. So now we're going to switch to a tour based on looking at various items that I have bookmarked in the browser. So I'm just going to hit escape now out of the presentation, and we're going to come over here to Firefox, and we're going to go back to the modern map of downtown Albany and downtown Rensselaer. This is the same area we looked at earlier in the 1843 map. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing, again, 787 across the waterfront. We're seeing Rensselaer, where this island once existed, but now it's all filled in, and its rail yard. The railroad bridges basically date from the Civil War era. There's only one of them left. There were once two. This railroad bridge is about to receive a very substantial reconstruction, really a brand new bridge, because it's pretty old. It originally built in 1865, substantially reconstructed around 1900, and now it's got a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit, one train at a time. It has become a bottleneck. And Amtrak still uses it. It's not heavily used for freight anymore, but it's a major part of Amtrak's network. But we should talk about the myth of the waterfront in Albany. Because I already showed you the Albany Basin. Basically, the Erie Canal ran along what's now today labeled Erie Boulevard. It was pretty common when the Erie Canal was decommissioned to fill it in and make it into a street and name it Erie Boulevard, and you'll see that pattern repeated all across New York State. The basin was down here. You see the Corning Park, Corning Preserve area inside of 787. This is an underutilized park because it's difficult to access. It's very, very common for people to talk about how 787 cut Albany off from its waterfront. And while it is true today that 787 is a major obstacle to access to the waterfront, I'm about to make an argument that 787 is not principally at fault. So let's move on to the next page that I've tabbed here. This is Open Historical Map of the same area, and the slider is set to 1815. So in 1815, the Erie Canal's not built yet. The railroad lines don't exist yet either. That's a detail in the map that needs to be worked on, is figuring out the correct start date for those. So I'm going to move the time slider on the bottom of Open Historical Map. And we see the Erie Canal opens in 1823. There was a construction project to build the basin, dig it out. I don't have full details on that project yet, so this is basically kind of springs into existence in 1823. We have the mouth of the canal in its original form here. So in 1823, Albany built the Albany Basin in this area. What did that actually mean? Well, the Albany Basin was basically a commercial transportation hub. It was where riverboats bringing goods up to the terminus of the canal would be parked, offload their cargoes onto canal boats, and the canal boats would then go onto the canal. So this was a busy commercial transportation hub. Additionally, engineering wasn't really great, and so it tended to be very stagnant. The water didn't really move through. And finally, the city had a number of sewers dumping unprocessed sewage into the basin. So it didn't smell good because it didn't flow, so the sewage just kind of sat there unpercolated. So any illusions of people putting on their fine clothes and parading with parasols along the Albany Basin should be dismissed. It wasn't a fun place. And that was how cities in the period treated their waterfronts. So we're going to move the time slider a bunch. We see the railroad bridges have appeared now because it's after the Civil War. I'm going to start bumping the time slider a year at a time through the 1890s. The reason I'm doing that is we're about to get into the early 1900s, and the canal is about to be decommissioned in favor of the barge canal. So the canal has vanished. The barge canal is being put into operation. So the north end of the basin is filled, the terminus of the canal is filled. So what happens with the waterfront when they do that? Well, what happens with the waterfront is that they basically turn all of this space over to New York Central, and it becomes a rail yard servicing the passenger terminal, which was located in this part of downtown Albany. So if you have any illusion that people were crossing the rail yards to go visit the river, that wasn't happening. The basin did continue to exist until 1950, and there was an Albany Yacht Club there. Still didn't flow. Conditions maybe got better, but the rail yard was still a thing, and there were a lot of passenger trains passing through here. The basin would finally be filled around 1950. There it is. It's there in 52, 53. It's getting filled in. But this area gets turned over to the New York Central too, so it's still all rail yards down there. And so eventually 787 is built through here. 787 is not shown on the map, but really at no point from 1823 to the construction of 787 did Albany ever really have great access to its riverfront. And at the time, people didn't think about that. They didn't really care that much. And so that's a thing to consider when you talk about this. So now we're going to talk about sourcing of these maps. Because, you know, where does data come from? What kinds of things do we look at? So this is going to be one of the early examples of a source. This is something that I built a mosaic based on 1892 insurance maps of Albany. The Sanborn insurance maps are pretty famous as a source. Historians love these because they're so precise and they tell you exactly where things were. They're typically released by the Sanborn Insurance Company at roughly 10-year intervals for most communities in the U.S. above a certain size. I've worked with Sanborn maps all over upstate New York and even into Iowa, and you know, they're just incredibly useful resources. So you can see a lot of detail about the city of Albany in this mosaic. And also I'm using a tool called Map Warper, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about Map Warper. But as you can see, it's got a lot of value in terms of being able to take these old maps and snap them into alignment with a more modern map in order to sync things up, and that's a big piece of how we actually make this stuff work. Let me see. Okay, this is my mosaic of 1952 aerials, which are from the USGS Earth Explorer site. This is a set of public domain aerial images of the Capital District and beyond. It's a fairly expansive set. I haven't really determined what its exact limits are. But 1952, we can zoom in on downtown Albany, since we've been talking about waterfront. And we can see the southern part of the basin. We can see all the rail yards. I haven't really tried to map the rail yards yet, but this is all servicing Union Station, which is located right here. That's, you know, subsequently became part of the North Star and then Fleet Bank, and I'm not sure how it's being used now. But we can see how 787 overlaid this and how the rail yards got replaced with parking garage, because, yeah, that's... We basically built parking garages between 787 and so that is the transformation that Albany voted for when 787 was built. Is a particular point of interest about 787. We sometimes forget the historical details of it. The current talk is about replacing 787 with kind of a ground level boulevard with grade crossings. That was actually the original plan for the Riverside Arterial through along the river, and the reason why they built a huge interstate, a massively overbuilt interstate, in my view, was that a huge pot of federal money became available. And it's like, okay, if the feds will give us all this money to build a interstate highway, who are we to turn this down? And the other thing that we can see here is that this is the old Maiden Lane Bridge, which went away about the same time that New York Central abandoned downtown Albany. And down here, we have the modern Dunn Bridge. This is the old Dunn Bridge, and we see a really distinctly different highway configuration here, completely replaced by 787, but you can see this isn't really the kind of thing that lends people to coming down to see the river either. I mean, it was just not a thing people did. And I don't object at all to the plan for a boulevard and better river access. I think it's probably an excellent idea. I just object to the mythology. So that's, I guess that's a me problem, but, you know, so be it. Let me see what's next on the agenda. Okay, so this is a 1758 map of Albany. So the British are in control. They have built a wall around the city. There is an actual fort up here. This is State Street. So we can, I believe, quickly, is there an overlay of this map? There isn't, but there can be. Sometimes Map Warper shuts down these overlays in order to save on space. So by reissuing the rectification, I can get an overlay. So let's hop over here to preview, where we now have an overlay. This is a map that I got from Don Rittner. This is showing where Road Street was. Road Street's mostly forgotten today. There is a tiny surviving segment of it along in Sheridan Hollow, but it's been slowly eroded by urban development. But yeah, we see the fort is up here on State. That right in here, and then we have the Capitol. So yeah, the fort's right down here. And we have roughly outlined the location of the wall in downtown Albany in OpenHistoricalMap, because they have a rough idea of where that is. There are archaeological records of digs, some of them in basement buildings, and they found remnants of the wall in Albany, and have supposedly preserved all of that to the extent that they can. So that's an interesting thing. And then my final example of old maps and preservation. This is not actually an old map, but this is a map from 1970. An archaeological dig was done before 787 was built through here. Because knowing that this was the approximate location of the Dutch fort, Fort Orange, they went to the trouble to go digging before 787 was built. The actual dig was in this area shown by the banded markings. And then the outline is their conjecture for the footprint of the fort. So you'll find there is a historical marker over here on Broadway for the fort, because that's as close as you can put one, since the fort proper was under the railroad tracks in 787 and its ramps proper. And so after they excavated and found artifacts, they filled it back in, and so that is buried underneath 787, probably largely intact. But I was able to align this footprint in Map Warper and also map Fort Orange in OpenHistoricalMap. So let's come over here. Let's go back to 1952 aerials to talk about that subject. One of the things that I find particularly interesting to do in OpenStreetMap. And I have done this a bit in New York City and in Albany, and I have been encouraging people to do some of this work. Let me get the correct place precisely here. Yeah, missing a little bit because I wasn't quite precise enough. This is the area around Crossgates Mall. If you're a Capital District resident, you know this place. If you've been in the Capital District for a long time, you know that there are certain elements of this mall that are controversial. So we're going to look at the 1952 area long before this mall was built. And the two elements of this mall that are controversial, well, more than two. One was that it was built in Pine Bush, which is mostly treated as a protected area because it is a unique biome and home of the endangered Conner blue butterfly. And the fact that Pyramid Corporation wanted to build a mall there ticked off a lot of people because they pretty much lawyered and steamrollered the opposition, and they were never very popular. Subsequently, they have gone ahead and behaved like developers. So, for example, they have been buying up this residential neighborhood between Western and the mall, letting the homes that they buy up deteriorate to drive down property values and drive residents out, the usual developer sort of thing to do. But the main reason this is interesting, and the thing that I'm kind of getting at in an elliptical way, is that Crossgates is right next to Rapp Road. And why is Rapp Road interesting? Well, Rapp Road is an example of a historically minority community. And it's a community that was built up in the 20s and 30s by African American families from Mississippi, of all places. They followed their reverend to the south end of Albany. They weren't real happy living in the city. They were from a rural community in Mississippi. The reverend, understanding their unhappiness, managed to raise enough money to buy up a piece of property here and started selling lots to his congregationers along Rapp Road. And so if we look at it in the modern OpenStreetMap view, we see the gray area today, which is the Rapp Road Historic District. And if we scan to 1952, we see that the outlines match up pretty effectively with the cleared and settled areas in 1952. In 1952, it's pretty intact. And the primary incursion we see is that the city and state built Washington Avenue Extension through Rapp Road and took a chunk off the north end of the community. That's really the only major impact it had. Crossgates tried to start buying up Rapp Road, and the effort failed because it's a very cohesive community, and they banded together in order to protect their neighborhood. So that's an interesting example of families that had lived together for generations deciding to hold on to what was theirs. By comparison, I have mapped Seneca Village in New York City, which was a majority-minority neighborhood, predominantly African American, in New York City, in an area that's now part of Central Park. That was families that had escaped the Five Points neighborhood of Manhattan and moved into an area where they were happier. There was also a minority component of Irish there who were basically happy to get out of 5 Points too. New York City decided to just take that property in 1857 for the park, and so it was completely wiped out. And I was able to map Seneca Village based on archaeological studies that had been done in that area So I mapped Rapp Road here in OpenHistoricalMap off of the 1952 aerial because it shows where a lot of this stuff was back then. And I need to set start dates on this, and because it's showing up in 1900 now, and no, it wasn't there in 1900. That's my omission. We'll deal with it. Okay, so got to remind myself why. Erie Canal. I briefly mentioned the terminus of the Erie Canal. It has major relationship to the city of Albany, as Albany was selected as the eastern terminus of the canal way back at the beginning. So resources for mapping the Erie Canal. One of them is the 1834 Hutchinson Survey, which shows the canal more or less in its original configuration before the first enlargement began. So this is the Hutchinson map showing the original lock to the Hudson, the little basin, some of the side basins, and the path of the canal out of town along Erie Boulevard. I've found these to be a mixed bag in terms of being able to align these maps in Map Warper. They are so old that much of the urbanized area of the Capital District basically didn't exist. So here through Watervliet, I have had some success aligning it where it passes through the Arsenal and passes northward. I mean, these aren't great, but they're not bad. And so I have done some preliminary canal mapping through here. Here is a early version of the Watervliet side cut lock, the upper one. There is a lower side cut lock below the Arsenal, which is not really a thing yet in this at this point in time. That was a political stop. The people of Troy basically wanted access to the canal too, so they put in the side cut so that people could choose to leave the canal and interact with Troy. The other thing that's interesting that I'll point out, and we'll visit this in more detail, you see here that this pathetic little stream alongside 787 looks really different from 1834. This is basically Green Island once really being an island as opposed to what it is now, is that the construction of the canal caused this branch of the Mohawk to silt up. The silt up was before 787. I mean, 787 basically took advantage of the fact that their canal was through here and this old riverfront, and so it was never built up. So it was pretty easy to build through here if you were willing to fill in a bunch of river, which they did. So that's a quick look at the Hutchinson maps. Now we're going to look at a newer set of maps. This is a set of maps called the Schilder Maps. The Schilder Maps were released after a survey of the canal in 1896, so it's a much later version of the canal, about 15 years before the barge canal superseded it, and it was basically abandoned, in many cases promptly filled in. So this shows the Albany terminus in 1896. So the basin is still here. It will be filled in 5-6 years. We have a much larger version of the basin. We see the footprint of the old basin here. This is now a dockage area. Extensively built up since 1834 as the canal got really busy. Now we'll head north and look at the area up around the Arsenal. And we see the lower side cut lock, the grounds of the Arsenal. Now we see the upper side cut lock in its form in 1896. Again, we zoom in and we see this configuration was radically different back then. They actually, in large part, this silted up because they had actually bracketed that off to create a basin here, so the water flow deteriorated, so the northern end of this channel silted up. Another interesting note for residents of the Capital District. Let's let this show up here. In 1896, this was the site of the Waylock. It was one of the tolling stations where they would weigh the canal boats to figure out what tolls to charge for use of the canal. And if we dial up the modern map, we actually see it's Maplewood Historical Park right off of 2nd Avenue, New York 32, north of Waterville, south of Cohoes. There's a historic markers parking, and you can go see the foundation of this. It's still there. Now we're going to follow this north a bit and look at Cohoes. The Schilder Maps show us so this is where the modern, this is where the enlarged canal turned up the hill away from the Champlain Canal. The Champlain Canal continued north. It's good to compare this. I do not recall how many Hutchinson maps I have tried to line up here. The Hutchinson maps are hard to align, but I've got some of them here. Yeah, not as much as I would like. But basically, the canal in 1834 is not as high up the hill. It actually went up the hill alongside what Main Street is now, and you can kind of see some remnants of the old canal here on the Schilder map. I mean, some of this canal was turned over to the Cohoes Company and used for water power supply to industries in Cohoes. The Champlain Canal went north more or less along the Cohoes, the 787 corridor, which is labeled Cohoes Boulevard. So New York 787, the extension of I-787 north, was basically built on the old Champlain Canal footprint. And this dam, a version of this dam goes back a long time, back into the early 1800s, because the Champlain Canal crossed the mouth of the Mohawk River here on the level without locks and continued north. And a bit of the old Champlain Canal survives today. Now, having done all of this mapping on the Erie Canal, what can I do with it? Well, this is a little thing I built using OpenStreetMap and OpenHistoricMap, where OpenStreetMap is providing a base map, and I have then basically pulled all of the canal data out of OpenHistoricMap and drawn it as a colored overlay over OpenStreetMap. And I actually can substitute other base maps and base imagery, so this is a modern map box image of the same area. And so we can see Barge Canal on its modern path through Waterford and into the Mohawk. We can see versions of the old canals here. The light blue canal is actually the power canal that feeds today. Some of that is repurposed Erie Canal. We see other versions, the green here is original Erie Canal, the blue is enlarged canal. Here, over here in red is original Champlain Canal, whereas the modern Champlain and Erie Canals travel up the Hudson until they reach Waterford, and then there is the split, and the Champlain Canal continues north along the Mohawk to Fort Edwards. Likewise, I can bring up the 1952 aerials here, which is something I want to do because we want to go zoom in on Cohoes. And I'm going to show you here the extent to which the canal, even though it was abandoned around 1915, is still surprisingly visible in 1952 aerials, parts that simply have not been built over yet. And then for anybody who's interested in a comparison to the modern map, this is an excellent place for it, because in OpenStreetMap we can see that this is Elm Street into Maplewood. These are the corners of the old lock, and this actually survives in fairly solid condition. Historic marker up here. So this is the one you can actually go visit, although it's not a mowed area. It's not really maintained for access on foot, but nonetheless it's there even today. So let's take a look at that in Mapbox Satellite. And this, yes, even today you can see the remnants of the lock in Mapbox Satellite. Over here, I'm told there are surviving elements of culverts that connect up to the canal, although that's private property, so I wouldn't go wandering in there without permission from the owner on general principles. They can get a little touchy when they see random people wandering around the backs of their business, which is, you know, I get that. There was a lock once in here, but that's now basically a gravel pit. Norlite mines it for abrasive materials. Let's put the canal overlay back in. So this lock is, I believe, buried. There are pieces of this lock here, but that's railroad, or is that bike path? Okay, that's... I'm trying to remember if this is bike path access here or if this is just old road bed. Yeah, I'm thinking that the bike path doesn't extend down to here. Maybe OpenStreetMap will help us. Okay, that is currently considered a path that ends on Alexander Street. Okay, now the bike path is all the way up here, but this is a path and you could walk it to that lock and probably get a good look at things. Maybe I should do that someday in my copious spare time, and maybe I should improve this to match that lock layout more precisely. I know how to do that, you know. There's some remnant of lock up here along this path. Pieces of lock up here, as I understand it, but kind of buried. There's some lock underneath these structures. I forget what they are. Yeah, fire station. Yeah, there is some lock visible if you go around the back of the fire station. Less visible up here. But yeah, you see the path the canal followed has not been built up. There's certainly a surviving chunk of lock there. So you could go see that. There is, there is a trail past that lock. We would do that on foot. There are some bits back here. This is behind Harmony Mill. The original canal, actually this red along here represents the canal as built in 1823. In 1837, they routed the canal behind this to provide space for Harmony Mills expansion and construction. And then in 1840, they actually moved the canal up the hill. So this is just a bit of a tour. There's some surviving lock here, some surviving lock here. So this is all very much a work in progress, and I'm not claiming that any of this is precise as it ultimately can be, but it has been fun to develop this map and understand where things were. So let me see, what else do I want to talk about here? Oh yeah, that's right. I wanted to talk a little bit about life cycle. Because, you know, things change over time, and one of the challenges we have dealt with in OpenHistoricMap is understanding representations of change. So this is area around Cohoes, New York. Okay, so we see this dam here. That dam was there all the way back in 1900. That dam diverts water into the power company canal. So if you wanted to talk about why the Cohoes Falls mostly don't have water going over them, it's because of that dam and the diversion into the power canal. That's been there a long time. But if we come up here and look at this bend in the river, I'm going to move the time slider. And I want you to pay attention to the shape of the Mohawk River right through here. In 1910 to 1912, they built the new dam. The new dam's purpose was to facilitate construction of the barge canal. The barge canal, basically, whereas the Erie Canal in its original form was parallel to the Mohawk but not really part of the Mohawk. The Mohawk itself was largely undisturbed. When they went to build the barge canal, which today is called the Erie Canal, designed to create confusion, one of the things that happened is that they chose to canalize the Mohawk River by building dams and locks. So this is where the barge canal leaves Waterford to enter the Mohawk, and I haven't really done the polygons to show the full width of the barge canal here, but just imagine it. So at this point, the canal is being, the old Erie Canal, which crossed here on a aqueduct, is being abandoned. And in fact, the aqueduct was taken down in 1915, but is being abandoned in order to allow the barge canal to go just in the river proper. And so we see this radical change in the width of the Mohawk because it was dammed up. And so that's an example of life cycle. And it's a thing that we're trying to get a grasp on and how to represent it in OpenHistoricalMap. I'm not going to go into the technical issues of why it's challenging, but let's just say that it takes a little work to think your way through how to model some of this stuff. I'm not seeing any questions, so I think I'm going to wrap this up, and I will be available on various media to talk about anything anybody wants to from this presentation. But I'm going to wrap it up for today because 50 minutes is about long enough. So tomorrow back to indoor bike riding on Zwift, and I'll have to see what the schedule looks like for the next online presentation about OHM. Probably in a week, and I think I was planning to use historical mapping and geography as a way of framing history in the upper Hudson River and Champlain area, talking about colonial times. That really helps understanding what was going on if you understand how the French and the British and the natives were all interacting with the geography of the lakes and the river. So until next time, see you on a bike ride or on a historical stream.